Ready? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have said good morning, boys and girls, but actually you're not boys and girls anymore. You are ladies and gentlemen. And today is a very exciting moment in time. For me, as a father and a technologist and a business person, you're aware of things that influence history. Not just a moment in time, but influence history. And the people who have that impact and that effect are very few and far between. So we're very privileged to have Dr. Vint Cerf with us here today. And we'll run through a little bit of background. You've obviously all Googled, because that's the proper medium to use to find out about you, Google, for obvious reasons, as much as you can. And you've come up with some fascinating questions that we're going to get into just in a moment or two. There are still people arriving, which is a good thing. It's good to see so many of you travel for so far today as well, which is excellent. And we're going to try and get through all the questions that have been asked today. That's going to be a bit difficult because we've got a challenge in time, but we're going to do our best if that's all right. Also, a couple of years ago in business, in a room like this, your parents would have been told to switch your phones off. You've got a unique opportunity here. Tweet as much as you can, take as many photographs as you can, because you should. This really is a moment that you shouldn't forget and really keep for as long as you can. So, my name is Graham Gordon. I represent Scotland IS today. I'm on the board of Scotland IS. I've been representing and working with Scotland IS, which is our trade body, the digital industry's trade body in Scotland. And what we're here to do is promote working, using, developing, exporting, importing digital industries, knowledge and technology in and out of Scotland, part of the Scottish economy. And you guys in this room are a massive part of the future of the Scottish economy. So hopefully we can convince you that, sorry, if we can go back a slide. If we can convince you that technology, in the broad terms, is a future for you to work in and make some money. But there are ways of making money, and we'll run through that today. So from our point of view, just very briefly as a background, globally, there are currently a gap in the marketplace. IDC is a research institute, and they produce figures on a regular basis. They're usually paid to produce these figures. Don't get me wrong, nothing's for nothing. There are about 1.7 million vacancies in the cloud industry globally. So there's a lot of jobs out there if you're interested in anything to do with that type of industry or that sector, from sales right the way through to product development and research. 1.7 million jobs. From that, in the USA, in July alone this year, 3,600 jobs were created within the cloud sector. And you'll see why we're talking about the cloud sector as we move forward. And that number is going to go year-on-year growth at 3.9% until 2020. So what does that mean for you guys? As a job selection, as a career future, as a working path to get you to retirement, which might seem a long way away for some of you, there is employment here. There is a future in technology. And it's not going back the way, it's increasing. In Scotland, we produce approximately about 1,700 computer science graduates a year, roughly about 1,700, for about 7,000 digital jobs in the industry across the market sector in Scotland. Massive opportunity, not just globally, but right here on your doorstep and where you've been brought up and you've been raised. And solving that skills gap is really what we're here to do today. I was very fortunate to have a dinner with Dr. Cerf last night, and it wasn't about the product. It was about how we solve the problems that are in front of us and how we go through that. And hopefully we'll get some of that out today with the interaction that we have here. But things are not always as they were. Two brand names that you might realize there, that Kodak, for one, should have been celebrating 125 years in business this year. But unfortunately, they've gone into administration. This is the company that invented the digital camera. No longer exists. How many of you got photographs in your phone? More than 1,000 photographs in your phone? Okay, good. I like that style. It used to cost you about £5 per 36 photographs to get the photographs developed. So work out how many times 36 you've got on your phone, and that's what I used to pay when I was your age to get the photographs I was taking into reality. And you're taking these photographs all the time. Kodak were an instrumental part in what they were doing there. HMV had the idea of online music streaming and selling about 2 or 3 years before Apple did, but failed to maximize on that idea. So a good idea is a 10 a penny, but actually making them work is the important part. So are we thinking big enough? Have you got the Millennium Falcon in your front room? Are you thinking at that size? And that's really what we want to do today. We want to investigate if you guys, if we can make you think big enough, beyond the normal boundaries that perhaps you feel that you're sitting there. And some of the names that you've got here, you'll recognize. Up there in 100 years' time, and Dr. Cerf is very modest about the situation, Dr. Cerf will be in that room there. Last night I was having dinner with Alexander Graham Bell. That's the moment in history to me as an engineer and as a person of this modern age. And that's how you should view this opportunity today. It's very relevant. But these are the big thinkers that solved problems on a global scale when they were given problems, or actually went and found problems and solved these problems. Quite appropriate that today when we're announcing the first genetically produced brain, I know that we think that some people in the Big Brother house have probably got genetically produced brains and had for some time, that Franklin is relevant here with the research and work that she did in DNA. So really relevant, not just in the technology sector. But some of you might recognize Craig Ferguson, who has nothing to do with technology, but actually he sets the pace and the vision for how I'm viewing today and how we're viewing it. Craig Ferguson is an ex-Glasgow comedian who is now an American citizen, went to America in 2008, and you should YouTube him, because some of his stuff's pretty entertaining, pretty funny. But one of his narratives was that in the late 50s and early 60s, what advertisers did was stop focusing on people who had knowledge and experience, you might call them old folk, and started focusing on young folk who had no knowledge or no experience. And the reason they did that is they could sell you anything. And at that point, science became science fiction, round about the same time. Science and technology, there was a blurred line between the two, and we start giving promises of the future that possibly weren't deliverable. And I'll explain what I mean here. 1969, we went to the moon. Massive engineering feat. Even by today's standards, a massive engineering feat. But we're now doing space travel through private companies, where this took the resources of an entire nation. But at the same time, we were promised Star Trek. Now, I know you all think that Chris Pine is Star Trek. News for you, there was a Star Trek before Chris Pine, and this is what it looked like. The spaceship that we'd travel around in was vast and looked like this, and everybody was comfortable wearing nylon outfits. Then a generation later, we're in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, which for me is quite exciting. And space travel and spaceships look like this. But we were being sold a future. How real was that future as we were moving through this? This is the reality of space travel, reusable space travel. Something that's about the size of a bus, cockpit-wise, a very complex bit of machinery manned by extremely brave people, taking that step and thinking big. Thinking big got us into space again with the shuttle, which is a tremendous technical achievement. And then with the space station latterly, where we're sitting just now. And the reason I put that photograph there is what's upside down, what's the wrong way round. You know, the whole concept of the right way up and thinking out of the box and thinking big enough is tremendous. That's where we are with space travel. But no longer. We're now entering into a stage of space travel that is funded by private business instead of governments. So what opportunities does that offer you? Instead of being part of NASA, why not be part of Virgin Galactic? The opportunities are coming closer to home. We discussed last night that really big engineering problems get smaller all the time because they become cheaper. Computers that were room-sized before are now in all your pockets. Space travel is coming, maybe not to you guys affordably, but to your next generation, probably definitely. So who are your inspirational thinkers? We want you guys to think. Today is about a dialogue, and not just me or Dr. Cerf standing here talking to you. It has to be a dialogue. Who are the people that make you feel smart while they're still smart? So when I was your age, there was a chap called Carl Sagan who took the cosmos and made an extremely, and some of your teachers might have the same hairline as I have, and they will remember Carl Sagan. He took a very complex science and made it understandable on primetime television. 2 generations later, this guy pops up, and he does exactly the same thing. If you spend 20 minutes in a room with Professor Brian Cox, you think you understand particle physics. No, you don't. But he's really good at making you feel that way. And that's what smart people do. They make you feel smart and inspire you to move forward. But some of you might think that Sheldon does the same sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with that. And the progression to this point is that you're fed so much information and so much data sitting on your derrieres, backsides, that in your pocket, that all the information that's got all these people and the engineering and the society to this point, it's delivered to you on demand when you want it. So you might be part or classed as the generation YouTube. You might recognize some of these names here from these people here who are 6 or 7 of the top vloggers on YouTube. And they are serious players. They are serious players in the part that out of those 6 or 7 people, their average age is 19. So you can relate to 19 more than you can 46. I appreciate that. But that's not a bad place to be. They've got a combined views of 2.3 billion on their YouTube channels. So what does that mean to an old duffer like me? In the season 2012-2013, the top 10 shows in America had a combined viewing audience of 166 million. 2.3 billion on YouTube, 166 million for primetime television. So you guys are accessing video and content and education in a completely different way. And Dr. Cerf, I'll speak about that a bit later on. That is a massive disruptor for the future of education, business, everything that goes around it. 8 billion people on the planet, 3 billion have accessed the internet already. In the next 10 years, more people will have accessed the internet for the first time than they're currently accessing the internet. Opportunity. What can you feed them? What can you give them? What can you get that 2.3 billion views to be to your product or your service or your personality? That's really what we're trying to do, is get you thinking that way. But video demand is not new. This is a Betamax videotape from 1977, and this was the start of video on demand. I want to watch a video when I want to watch it. I don't want to go to the cinema with 400 other people. I want to watch it in the privacy of my own home. That's video on the demand properly. And that's when it really first started. But in 1982, the games industry, slot machines, can you imagine going to an arcade to play Space Invaders, made $8 billion in quarters. So 79 pence an application or a piece of software or a game is not new. $8 billion in quarters in 1982. Massive numbers. What are you going to do for the next generation forward or as you move forward there? So some of the people enthusing us just now and the leaders you've got in our space and in your space are all very familiar faces. They have done some amazing things in business, with business, for business, and are real innovators in the space that we're all occupying just now in different ways. They've all affected our daily lives. You know, even Dyson in the top, just for some reference in the room, Mr. Dyson, who makes the thing that tidies up the mess behind you, just for your reference there. And one of those key points is the internet. So from our point of view and where we're sitting, surfing the internet is a happy coincidence. He never takes credit for that statement, and he's quite right too. But it is a happy coincidence, but we're very happy to have him here. The experience I've had so far with Dr. Cerf, that he does listen to what you have to say and gives it purpose. So use the opportunity today when we run through our questions. And I haven't showed him any of these photographs, so you might kick me a bit later on, so we'll work that one out. You know, the development of technology is not just about listening, but it's about doing and actually demonstrating that, hey, this can be fun. It's not all Venn diagrams and Gantt charts. And what I really like about this picture is even if you've built the network out of courgettes, there's resilience in the network. To me, that appeals in so many ways. And moving forward from that, he still occasionally has time to game. If you look at the controller, it's maybe not just PS Vista, but it's there, and is interested in what's going on there, and very aware of where we are, and has met some fantastic people as he's progressed, and is willing to relate those experiences as himself and as part of the audience. And some of the people you will recognize. Anybody recognize the big hairy ape in the picture? It's a leading question, don't answer it, okay? And most recently been very well recognized and rewarded, but that reward and recognition has been a long-term process. From inventing the first commercially available email system in 1992. But the problem is, very few people had computers to use it on. So that big thinking had to be at the right moment and right time to have a dramatic effect. But we're going back 20 years with that sort of innovation. The recognition that he's brought to the table and from awards is on a global basis. If you're anybody writing a personal statement just now for university or thinking about it? Any hands in the air? Please do go and Google Dr. Cerf's biog. That's a personal statement and a half. I felt quite inadequate reading it the other day. But that lifetime of achievement has been recognized very, very well through the process. And really, the thing that you're all using in your pocket just now, the web you take for granted, whether it's Facebook or whether it's email or whatever it is, couldn't work without the invention of the TCP/IP protocol and the coming about of the internet at that point. And that's what I mean. That could have it been invented by someone else? Yes. Could have it been done at a different time? Yes. But it was invented at this moment in time, and a historic changing event, history-changing event as we've gone through this, which is really exciting. So that's a little bit of background about Dr. Cerf. You can Google all the detail that you like in it, but I think the real value is in the dialogue that we're about to have, and I hope we're about to have. We're going to get through as many of your questions as we can. I'm going to stay up here, if that's all right, so we can relay back and forth. And we're going to get through some set questions up here, and then hopefully get through some additional questions as well. So, first question from, sorry, I missed the school there. Was that, sorry, anyway. In your opinion, what's your opinion of the government trying to reclaim the internet? Hands up if you're from the school who asked that question. Anybody in the room? And the school was, sorry? Excellent, thank you very much, good to see you. So, in your opinion, the government trying to reclaim the internet, and what are your feelings on how safe and free it is to share your opinions on the internet? Dr. Cerf.
Well, so thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me here. I hope that this turns out to be a useful time for you. If not, at least you got to avoid school for an hour or so that's at least one benefit. With regard to this notion of reclaim, the government really never had a claim on the internet. It's true that in America, the Defense Department funded the research that led both to the internet and its predecessor, the ARPANET, but it did it in a way that involved a broad range of individuals, typically graduate students, not even the principal investigators. And so they really let this go and let it develop largely on its own. The issue now, of course, is that once the internet has dispersed as greatly as it has, there are both uses and abuses that occur. So it should not be surprising to anyone. Anytime you create an infrastructure, there's always a possibility of abuse. If we use the road system as an analog for the internet, Bob Kahn and I invented a road system and said there are some simple rules. Please don't build vehicles that are longer than this or wider than that or taller than this or heavier than that. And as long as you stay within those limitations, and please stay on one side of the road while you're traveling in one direction. Don't use both sides of the road because that leads to collisions. Very simple rules would allow a wide range of vehicles to be invented and to be use that road system. So internet is a lot like that. We've given some simple rules. People have been able to invent a wide range of applications and a wide range of devices that can use it for communication. But now the problem is that this same infrastructure can be used for abusive purposes. The same thing could be said for the road system. Imagine people who, drink too much of your favorite product here in Scotland and get in cars and drive. They cause accidents, they harm themselves, and they harm others. So what do we do about that? Well, we don't stop making vehicles and we don't shut down the roads. We tell people don't do that. Yeah. We say to them, if we catch you doing that, if we catch you driving drunk, there will be consequences. It's my view that this internet system, which continues to grow, is an infrastructure which has so much potential benefit that we need to preserve it, all at the same time trying to deal with some of the abusive practices that show up. And so that's how we will have to cope with the internet problems. It's not shutting it down and it's not absolutely controlling it. It's a question of trying to train people how to use it safely and to tell people that if we catch you abusing it, that there will be consequences. In terms of sharing opinions on the net, it depends a good deal on where you are. In countries like this one, or in the United States or other parts of the world where democracy is the norm, freedom of expression is a very important part of the democratic environment. But there are places in the world where expressing your own opinion is hazardous to your health. And this is true whether you use the internet or any other medium for expressing that opinion. And in some sense, this probably is the one major lesson that I take away from the experience of the internet, and that is that we need to create an environment where, in fact, it is safe for people to express their opinions and to share their ideas. There is a flip side of this, and this has to do with people who express opinions that are harmful to others. And now we get into questions about anonymity and the possibility of saying things are not true and causing harm for other people. Once again, there isn't any magic mechanism. There's no piece of software you can use that will guarantee that no one will say anything harmful or that you can detect that something is harmful. We're back to reminding people what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate and relying on people to keep that in mind. So I think the internet is a big opportunity to remind people that we all live on the same planet. We all have common problems that we have to deal with. We should try to be helpful to each other and not harmful. And when the latter occurs, then there have to be consequences.
I mean, it's a good point that the technology is not the problem. It's the use of the technology, the road, the infrastructure, the bottle of whiskey, the whatever it is. That is a product. But it's an interesting point that you make that actually, would you be abusive to someone face to face? So what gives you the right to be abusive online? There's a line there that is culturally and morally correct rather than technologically. The technology doesn't enable that to happen. That is just you pushing the button or typing it in the right way. Stuart Melville? Who's here from Stuart Melville? Stick your hands in the air, please. You all hiding? Oh, you're over there. A bit higher? Yeah, that's a sort of elbow in the air. That's a hand in the air. That's much better now. How do you think an individual companion objects, for example, mobile phone and the cloud, are going to affect society?
So I'm actually very excited about this, and I'm glad that this question got asked. There's a phrase, Internet of Things, which is commonly used to talk about appliances and devices that are programmable, that have the ability to be controlled, managed, or that will report their condition to some other computer somewhere else. I use this in my home. I have a wine cellar which is monitored every few minutes. The temperature and humidity is sampled, and that's recorded and reported to a server down in the basement in my house. Whenever the temperature goes above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which I hope doesn't happen very often, I get an SMS on my mobile that comes from the computer that's monitoring that information. The idea that devices can communicate, it turns out to be a very powerful one, and it's a big opportunity, by the way. If you're looking for a possible business to get into, I want you to think for a little bit about the various appliances that we use around the house, in the office, at home, in the car, things you carry around with you. All of those devices, in theory, could be made to communicate. What they might communicate varies depending on what the device is, but mobiles in particular have turned out to be extraordinarily flexible devices that not only generate information thanks to what you do with them, or have sensors in them, whether it's images or sound or even other kinds of sensors that might be detecting hazardous materials, hazardous substances and things of that sort. All of them have the ability to capture information and share it. So imagine for just a moment if you establish a set of standards that will allow a device to report information or to get instructions from you. As soon as you establish those standards, third parties can offer to be helpful. So an example, entertainment systems. You probably all have a variety of entertainment devices at home, whether it plays music or displays videos or other sorts of things. Typically, when you sit down in front of this array of boxes, you have an infrared controller, remote controller, usually more than one per box. And if you're like me, you fumble around trying to figure out which one is the right one to control the box you're interested in. And after you figure that out, that's the one with the dead battery. So my theory is that we should throw away all those remote devices and use our mobiles on the local net in the house with all these devices on the net as well to do this remote management. But as soon as you establish standards to do that, put them all onto the local network in the house, you could offer, it could be offered by a third party to manage your entertainment for you. They could say, well, if you'll just go to this website, check off the music and the movies that you want to watch, and you give me access to your entertainment equipment, then I will manage that for you. All you have to do is to tell me what you want. And with the appropriate access controls, and I want to emphasize that, a third party now could build a business out of managing your entertainment for you. You can multiply that idea in a variety of different ways. In the United States, there's a program called the Smart Grid. This is a project that was started about 4 or 5 years ago to instrument devices that consume electricity and to have them report how much electricity they used and when, and also accept advice like, we're reaching a peak load in the local area. Maybe you don't need to heat the water right now because that will be more expensive than if you wait for a while. Or don't run the laundry at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when all of the air conditioners are running. Please do that later on in the early morning hours. That will not only conserve electricity and avoid having to build unnecessary power generation capacity, but it will save you money because you won't be using electricity during the peak load. That kind of feedback, telling you about the consequences of your personal choices in using electrical equipment, or getting the equipment to not use electricity at the appropriate times, is a way of taking advantage of this communication capability. So I'm anticipating that there will be literally billions of devices that are online capable of communicating, accepting commands, and also reporting usage. And that is raw material for possible new applications and even new companies that can be built. So some of you may actually end up doing that as the rest of the decade unfolds.
So that addressable marketplace then is not, so the people you're selling to, you have a finite market because you're selling to people. But if you're selling to device, that, what you're saying is that market opens up n-fold from this point.
Possibilities,
Yeah.
that's right.
So just don't think about people, think about the devices that people are using, and that perhaps gives you an opportunity too. Braze High School.
Where's Bray High School?
Where are you?
There
you
you
go.
are. Okay, that's
Yeah.
very
That was
funny.
very brave of you putting your hand in the air in the middle of a room like this. And that's what colour would your kitten be? That's almost that question there, but we'll go. If the internet was an animal, which one would it be?
So I know you'd like it to be an elephant. I think it would be an octopus, actually. I mean, when you consider all the various things that you can do and how facilitating the internet can be, if it was anything, I think it would be that.
Okay. What do you think it would be? You're not entirely sure?
Maybe a
Spider. Spider. All right. See the thinking? Like the thinking there?
Actually, a more accurate thing might be a virus or a bacterium. And the reason is that those two kinds of life are enormously adaptable.
Yeah.
I mean, they are tenacious. They work everywhere. They adapt and change depending on local circumstances. And in some ways, the internet is like that because it's the software that animates it. And the software changes over time, sometimes in ways that you don't anticipate. And the consequence of that is new forms of, let's call it, digital life. So maybe we should think of internet as a virus.
And you guys really are living in a golden age because this is tip of the iceberg stuff. The infrastructure has been created to do all of this and a whole lot more that we haven't thought about, and we'll get on. That's a question that comes in a bit later on. We really are at the tip of the digital revolution, and take the revolution part of it, the digital way of life is really there for you guys to be had. How did you become interested in computer science?
Well, this is an interesting story. When I was 13 years old, which was a really long time ago, it was actually a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah.
My father had a friend who worked at an organization called System Development Corporation, which is in Santa Monica, California. It was a spin-off from something called RAND Corporation, which was a special research organization for the American Air Force. One of the projects that they had was called SAGE, which stood for Semi-Automated Ground Environment, which doesn't mean a thing to you. except that it was a tube-based computer. This is back in the days before we had transistors. Its job was to take radar information from the northern parts of Canada, what was called the distant early warning radars, in order to detect Russian bombers coming over the pole, possibly attacking North America. And the important thing was to distinguish between Russian bombers coming over the pole and Canadian geese coming over the pole, because we didn't want to launch a nuclear attack just because the Canadian geese were coming. Although if you've had any experience with Canadian geese, you might think otherwise. They do really bad things to your lawn and everything else. So I got to see this computer. It was so big that you literally walked into the computer in order to use it. It literally, the tubes covered the walls, multiple rooms full of these things. So I came in and I'm fairly astonished by what I see. It's a darkened room, the tubes are glowing red. It looked like Dr. Strangelove, except the movie hadn't been made yet. But I came away very impressed. 2 years later, that was 1958, 2 years later in 1960, my best friend got permission to use the computers at the University of California, Los Angeles. We were all of 17 years old at the time and quite excited about getting access to this very powerful kind of computational device. The one we used was called a Bendix G15. Again, probably means nothing to you, except the company used to make washing machines in addition to making computers. You had a picture of Alan Turing up there earlier. The Bendix G15 computer was based on a design that Turing had done, believe it or not. So I didn't realize that till recently. This was a paper tape-based machine, so you had to punch holes in the paper tape with a sort of a typewriter-like gadget, feed it into the machine, it would do a computation, and then punch out the tape, which you put into the flexo writer, and it would print the answers out. That was 1960. I was completely and totally hooked on the idea that you could make a computer do whatever you wanted to do. It was like creating a little universe, all of your very own, that you were in charge of, and it would do exactly what you told it. By the way, it didn't do exactly what you wanted it to do, it did what you told it to do. And if those weren't the same, that's called a bug. And we learned very quickly that it wasn't so easy to write software that didn't have bugs in it. So that was my first introduction to computer science. When I went to Stanford University as a math major, I took every computer science class I could, went to work for IBM, decided after 2 years at IBM that I needed to know more about computer science in the more fundamental sense. How do I make an operating system? How do I write a compiler? What's the theory of complexity? So I went back to, in this case, UCLA, got a PhD, and right in the middle of the PhD program, I was introduced to the ARPANET project from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, instantaneously infected with the network virus. And I haven't recovered. I'm still suffering from this terrible disease called internet.
Thank you. Ross High School, where are you? I want to see your hand in there. Thank you. Does that answer your question? Fantastic. Castlemilk High School, where are you guys? Anybody in the room? No? Okay.
Okay, so this is a good question.
When you were at school, was there any subjects that you studied and struggled with? Now, we know I'm so delighted that you actually struggle with remote controls like the rest of us as well. So,
well, I did well in high school, so I didn't have a problem there. And I got to Stanford University, and I discovered two things. Everybody at Stanford had been class valedictorian, and they were all incredibly smart. It was very challenging. And I was a math major. My last year at Stanford, I took Riemannian geometry. This is the material that Einstein's theory of relativity uses in order to express itself. And I found that fairly hard. So I decided that maybe I wasn't cut out to be a mathematician, and I went into computer science because that turned out to be a little easier. Of course, things got very complicated very fast as a result. Now we don't quite understand how the internet works either. But anyway, that was the hardest problem that I can remember facing, was Riemannian geometry in my last year at Stanford.
and before we move on, maybe just to build on one of the things you said last year, at 17, you and one of your fellow student or colleagues, they felt there were failures in maths at 17 because they hadn't published any papers. Go figure. But that expectation was so demanding in the environment you were in, I suppose.
This is really one of the pictures. There's three people that you saw with the funny little network that we built out of zucchinis and things like that. The man in the middle is Steve Crockett, who was my best friend and is my best friend. He's now chairman of ICANN. Yeah. But he and I were the ones walking down the street at age 17 thinking we were failures because all the mathematicians that we had known about had done all their best work in their teens. And so it was truly embarrassing that we thought we had done nothing significant up until then. Actually, it turned out okay in the long run. But
I was about to say, just to inspire confidence, the room, 17's not past it, and you're absolute proof of it, that is not the case. Loudon Academy, are you in the room? Yeah, hand in the air? No? Yeah, fine. Okay, should internet providers be taking more responsibility for monitoring what people are viewing and downloading?
No. Would
Great.
you like me to elaborate?
No, as an internet provider knows enough. That's, you know, I'm completely with you in that one, but yes, please, I think you should.
Yeah, so first of all, let me distinguish applications from this basic underlying transport. The internet is like this road system analogy that we used earlier. I think that if you are using an application like electronic mail, it's reasonable to expect the email provider to be checking to see whether or not attachments have viruses in them or other kinds of malware. That makes sense to me. What does not make sense to me is that the provider of the basic packet service, the ISP, internet service, is looking inside the packets. I think they have no business doing that. Now, if they are under attack, if it's a distributed denial of service attack of some sort, a botnet is launching traffic at a target, this, of course, the ISP has to be sensitive to. But I don't think that an internet service provider has a responsibility for examining the traffic that you're sending. If, on the other hand, if you're up in the application space, that's a different story, because you would expect the party providing you with applications to do something to protect you. Now, in the case of Google, our Gmail system has a very well developed system for filtering out malware that might be attached to an email. When we create the index of the World Wide Web at Google, one of the things our software does when it examines each web page is to look to see whether or not those web pages also have malware on board. And if that web page contains malware that's serving up to browsers, we mark the page as having malware. We don't do anything about it, we just mark it. We mark our index. If someone then uses the Google search engine and happens to end up going to that page, we detect that and we put a big red interstitial page up before you get there saying, we don't think you really want to go to that page, it has malware on board. You're still allowed to go, but we're trying to protect you from downloading malware. We set up an organization called Stop Badware. I'm the chairman of the board of that company. And its job is a not-for-profit, and its job is to help an infected website to clean out the malware. So Google is trying to do, at the application layer, things to protect people from harm, but it doesn't do it down at the packet level. It does it at the same level at which the harm occurs. And that's probably an important lesson for anyone who's thinking about the internet. It is a layered structure, and the harms that can occur at different parts of the system, different layers, and you have to attack them at the right layer in order to deal with the problem.
And so we're going to take a couple more questions off screen, then we're going to go into a piece of paper and take additional questions as well. I'd like you all to have a think about, we'll take some questions from the floor in between times, so have a thought process just now about what you would like to ask. Maybe it's one of the questions off the piece of paper, and there's a couple of roaming mics, so we'll do that in a couple of questions as well. I think that point is very valid, that where governments are saying an internet service provider should stop you from viewing certain materials, it's that application layers, that infrastructure layer. There's a lot of liability there that as a provider, what happens if we don't stop you and we've said we can? The liability there is also enormous, that there's got to be some self-use and self-policing and self-responsibility as well as a baseline. In the same way that a car's cruise control or the automatic braking system won't stop you having a crash. That's down to you as the user of the vehicle. So there's got to be some responsibility and accountability if this is going to move forward? Because there's a lot of press in the UK, as you're aware about this.
It's worth mentioning a couple of other things which some of you may actually help solve. One thing is that the operating systems that we use, whether it's Android or Apple's iOS or OS X or Microsoft software, all of those operating systems have vulnerabilities in them, and that's what's exploited in order to infect machines, to turn them into bots as part of botnets. So building better operating systems is a really important target, and for some people in this room with an interest in that, you could make a huge contribution by building more secure operating systems. Same thing arises on the browser side. The biggest hole in the internet today is the browser, because think about how it works. It goes to a website, it copies a file, the home page, it copies the file and interprets the file. The file has images, it has text, it has formatting information, and it often has executable code, whether it's Java or JavaScript or Python or something else.
Yeah.
The problem is that when that code is executed, it sometimes will affect the operating system that the browser is sitting on.
Yeah.
Because the operating system didn't protect itself adequately, and the browser didn't know that it had just downloaded a piece of malware. So building smarter browsers that are more paranoid, building operating systems that are more resistant to attack is actually important. And I've come to the conclusion that the only way to do that is to build hardware which works cooperatively with the software in order to protect the ensemble of the software and the hardware from these kinds of attacks, which means that we have some interesting opportunities ahead designing new hardware that will reinforce software security. There's an example of this recently. It's called encrypted BIOS. When you turn your machine on, what typically happens is a piece of microcode gets executed that downloads the operating system into the machine. And that little piece of code, that piece of microcode, if it downloads the wrong operating system, could be quite harmful, because you could be running something with a bunch of viruses or worms or Trojan horses in it. So what the chip makers have done recently is to arrange for that piece of microcode to be digitally signed using a cryptographic method called public key crypto. That means that the hardware will check to see whether or not this executable is digitally signed, and it won't run. It won't actually do the execution of that microcode unless the digital signature checks out. This is just one example of hardware reinforcing the security of the system. There's lots more that can be done and should be done in order to protect systems from various kinds of attack.
And that opportunity, again, as Dr. Cerf mentioned earlier, don't think about hardware as a tablet or a device or a laptop or a PC or a desktop, or a server. Think of it as a device. It's an embedded device in a washing machine because it needs an OS. It needs an operating system. So as the number of devices that are connected and are brought online, they all need an operating system of sorts. So think beyond, think bigger than how am I going to make the next browser look fantastic on my iMac, and actually how am I going to make this hotel and all the connected devices in a much smarter place to be. The opportunities are, again, tip of the iceberg stuff.
That could be fairly scary. You can imagine if people had programmed your refrigerator to attack your network. I mean, my God, we've just been overwhelmed by the refrigerators or the washing machines or something else. So we don't want that to happen.
No. And a very valid point. And when you take that outside of the domestic arena, that power plants, nuclear stations, infrastructure, all need the same sort of thing, but just on an industrial scale. So it's not just domestic, it's commercial and industrial. What future developments gets Dr. Cerf most excited?
Well, I have one particular activity which I've been doing since 1998. I'm a visiting scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, and have done there since 1998. My team at JPL and I started developing an interplanetary extension of the internet in 1998. We very, very quickly discovered that the TCP/IP protocols would not work in between planets.
Yeah.
It works on the planet just fine, but that's because the propagation delays in planetary space are actually quite short. Here on Earth, it's a few hundred milliseconds at worst. The trouble is, between the planets, the distances are really big. Just take Earth and Mars, for example. When we're closest together in our orbits, we're 35 million miles apart. At the speed of light, it takes 3.5 minutes for a signal to go from Earth to Mars, and of course, the same amount of time to come back. When we're farthest apart in our orbits, it's 20 minutes one way and 40 minutes round trip time for a radio wave propagating at the speed of light. So the problem we run into with the TCP protocols is that they wasn't designed to work with a 40-minute round trip time. The flow control is really, really simple in this protocol. Basically, when you run out of room, you tell the other guy, stop sending. The trouble is that if the other guy is 20 minutes away, then by the time he hears it, he's been transmitting to you for 20 minutes, and all the packets are falling on the floor and blowing away. So the standard flow control for TCP didn't work very well. There's another problem. It's called celestial motion. The planets are rotating, and we haven't figured out how to stop that. So if you're talking to something on the surface, when the planet rotates, eventually you can't talk to it because it's on the wrong side of the planet. That's a disruption. So what you end up with in interplanetary communication is variable delay and disruption. So we said, okay, TCP wasn't designed to deal with that. We invented a whole new suite of protocols that we call the bundle protocol. And that is now operating on Earth, on Mars, in the International Space Station, and a spacecraft called EPOXI, which is in orbit around the Sun and has rendezvoused with 2 comets in the last decade. We're standardizing those protocols so that we can offer them to all of the spacefaring nations around the world. So anyone who builds another spacecraft, whether it's a satellite or a robotic device or maybe a manned spacecraft, can use the same protocols. And that means we can all communicate with each other. But the more important thing is that once a scientific mission is complete, then the robotic spacecraft could be repurposed as a relay in an interplanetary network. So we've already started doing that on Mars. We have the 2 rovers plus the Mars Science Laboratory, and one of the rovers, I guess, is dead, but the other one is still operational, and the Mars Science Laboratory is fully functional. They are not communicating directly back to Earth from the surface of Mars. They're going through a relay, which was a repurposed survey satellite, which has been reprogrammed to be a store and forward packet switch relay. So the end result of all this is that we have this 3-node network communicating back to Earth and from Earth back to Mars. That's just the beginning. Yeah. And over the next several decades, we'll end up with what we believe to be an expanding interplanetary backbone to support both manned and robotic missions. But that's not the end of the story. It turns out there's another project which the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the U.S. funded last year. It's to design a spacecraft to get to the nearest star in 100 years' time. Now, this is a big challenge because the current propulsion systems that are available would take 65,000 years to get to Alpha Centauri, which is 4.4 light years away. That's a little long even for an ARPA project. So we need to invent an ion engine, which is capable of getting up to 20% the speed of light, so that we can get halfway to Alpha Centauri in 50 years' time, and then flip the spacecraft over and slow down, because otherwise we'll be blasting through the Alpha Centauri system at 20% the speed of light, and we'll get one picture, and that'll be it. It's a very expensive mission. So the whole idea here is to get into orbit around Alpha Centauri or one of its other 3 stars in that system. So that's problem number 1, is the propulsion. There's another problem called navigation. You realize the stars are not where they appear to be because of the speed of light delay to see them. So you can imagine, when you're doing interplanetary space travel, it's normal to do a mid-course correction somewhere in the process of getting from planet A to planet B. But imagine that you're a light year away on your way to Alpha Centauri, and you try to send a signal to tell it to do a change in its trajectory. It takes a year for the signal to get there and another year to find out what happened. And so this is not the most interactive system in the whole world. You have to do autonomous navigation. Now, fortunately, we have a pretty good idea of what the proper motion is of stars within about 10 light years of Earth. So we can actually program the spacecraft to use stars that are much farther away to orient themselves, because their positions won't change very much in a 4 light-year distance, and then use that to navigate. So that problem we think is solvable. And the last part is the one that I'm most interested in, and that's communicating. How do you generate a signal from 4 light-years away that you can actually detect? And you could say, well, how about using a femtosecond highly collimated laser? Femtosecond is 10 to the minus 15 seconds. So imagine you have a 100-watt power source. You compress the signal down to 10 to the minus 15 seconds. That's a really big pulse. We should be able to detect that. There's only one problem. Even if it's a collimated laser, over a 4 light-year distance, the beam spread is going to be substantial. It'll be about the size of the solar system. Now you know why I need the interplanetary backbone network, because I need to build a synthetic aperture receiver, which is about the size of the solar system, in order to detect the signal coming from Alpha Centauri when the spacecraft finally gets there. One of the physicists in this program has suggested another interesting alternative. You understand that gravity bends light. You remember that Einstein's theory was confirmed by looking at an eclipse of the sun and seeing a star from some distance, or maybe it was one of the planets, whose light moved slightly in accordance with Einstein's prediction about how much light would be bent by the gravitational force of the sun. So that means the sun could form a gravitational lens. The focal point is about 550 astronomical units away from the sun. 1 AU is 93 million miles. You can do the math. It's about 55 billion miles. The farthest we've ever gotten a spacecraft anywhere is about 13 billion miles away.
Yeah.
So it would take us a while to get to the 55 billion mile mark. But if we could get something there, we might, and position it properly, we might be able to collimate and refocus the signal coming from Alpha Centauri so that we could actually get that light gathered through gravitational force rather than having to do it with a synthetic aperture receiver. So that's the next plan, is to consider getting something out there. Let us test our ion engines too, to see whether we can actually get something 55 billion miles away. That's what I get all excited about.
So the statement, are we thinking big enough? An aperture the size of the solar system, are we thinking big enough? That's and also, if you talk about big projects and long delays, we're in Edinburgh. So, okay. And I'm from Aberdeen, so some projects don't get delivered at all, so we'll move on from there. I also read, I think it was back in 2008, and we're going to take a question from the floor, so think about sticking your hand up in a moment or two, please. Back in 2008, you were asked the question, what do you think the internet will look like in 2050? And your response was, I don't know, but I wish I was 8, which actually is a great response because you don't know. I mean, there's so much to happen between then and now.
You know, I'll tell you what. Let's do an experiment. Let's see. This is 2013, right? Well, let's imagine that all of you are transported back to 1963. It's 50 years ago. And the question is, what will you experience? And my prediction is that the first thing that would happen is within a week, every one of you would break your noses walking into doors that you thought were going to open by themselves. And your friends from that period would say, why did you do that? And said, well, where I come from, the doors open automatically for me. And they say, well, here you have to turn a knob to open the door. And you can imagine going into the lavatory and sitting here with your hands under the faucet, and your friend says, what are you doing? You say, I'm waiting for the water to come out. And you say, well, you have to turn this faucet handle. And you say, well, where I come from, you know, it just comes out automatically. And we won't even talk about when they ask you why you didn't flush the toilet. So that's what happens. That's half of the experiment, is what would happen to you if you went back 50 years in time. Now let's go the other way. Imagine that someone from 2063 comes here. The question is, what will they expect that would surprise them? And what would you experience meeting them that would surprise you? I don't know the answer to that, which is why, you know, if I were 8 years old, I could wait until I could find out. But it's that kind of speculative question that really gets me going. Because if you look even 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago, and ask yourself, could you have predicted 20 years ago what we're seeing now? I think the answer is very difficult. Some things, perhaps, like Moore's Law and the doubling of capacity every 18 months, but other things much harder. So I was just reading the other day that there are handheld devices that are starting to sound like the tricorder from Star Trek.
Fantastic.
And so that's, even though Star Trek was, what, 40 years ago
Yeah.
now, they were imagining things that sounded like science fiction and that today are almost feasible, which suggests to me the best definition of engineering I've ever heard, turning science fiction into reality. That's what engineering is all about.
Excellent. Any questions from the floor? Anybody would like to stick their hand up and ask something? We have a question at the front. Braces, red tie. Are you in
There's
the
a
One Direction
microphone.
3D
A
movie?
microphone is coming.
Sorry, forgive me, okay. I'm flippant. There you are.
If you could create the internet today, would you do anything differently?
That's many people have asked that question, and I've asked that question of myself a few times. The answer is yes, I would do several things differently. The first thing I would do is to try to convince everybody that we should have 128 bits of address space instead of 32, because we ran out in 2011 of the 32-bit 4.3 billion terminations that were originally designed into the net. Now, I feel like I have to defend myself a little bit. When Bob Kahn and I were doing the original design literally 40 years ago, we said, first of all, we didn't know if this was going to work. And then we said, well, how many networks should we have in this internet thing? And we thought, well, how many networks will there be per country? And we had just finished building the ARPANET, which was a national size network in the United States, and it was fairly expensive. So we thought, well, maybe there will only be 2 networks per country, so there'll be some competition. Then we said, how many countries are there? And we didn't know the answer to that, and there wasn't any Google to ask, so we guessed. We said, well, it must be a power of 2, so we guessed it was 128. And then that meant 2 networks times 128 was 256. That's 8 bits.
Yeah.
And then how many computers? And we said, well, let's be generous. How about 16 million of them? That's 24 bits. That's 32-bit addresses. And we thought that would last for a while, and it did. However, here we are. It's 2013, and we need IP version 6, which is 128 bits of address space. So if I could have persuaded myself and everyone else that I needed that large an address space, I mean, think of it. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. How could you possibly convince anybody 40 years ago that you needed that size address space to do an experiment? Right, okay, so I didn't think that was feasible. The second thing I would do would be to put in more security mechanisms from the beginning. Now, today we can put in quite a bit of security, and we're in the process of doing that in many different layers in the net. The irony of all this is that around 1977, we were just on the edge of standardizing the internet that you're using today. You're using 1978 technology, basically. It's been re-implemented, but it is based on 1978 notions. In 1977, 2 of my colleagues at Stanford University published the first paper on public key cryptography, Whitfield Diffie and Marty Hellman. Unfortunately, they didn't implement it. They just described that it was possible. So by 1978, I had nothing other than classified military gear, which we couldn't use, to secure the net. So if I could go back in time, and if I could get access to public key cryptography in a timely way, I would have put that into the internet as well. Here it is 2013, and I am gangbusters on strong authentication, 2-factor authentication, and strong use of public key cryptography for key distribution and the like, all of which can be and is being retrofitted into the internet of today, but it would be nice if I could have had that done 40 years ago. Then we wouldn't have a lot of the problems we have.
But 40 years in a piece of technology, and you're saying you wish you had created what has just come about in 2011 with IPv6 and giving you that capacity. There's not many pieces of technology or infrastructure that have lasted 40 years, realistically. So I wouldn't beat yourself up too much about changing that now. But a good question to see where the future, and then possibly an additional connection or question off the back of that was, how much longer can you envisage the current rapid progression in computing technology continuing for? So that was Linlithgow Academy asked that question. So
I mean,
we were in the discussion last night.
is this going to continue evolving?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is absolutely. It depends on you, really. There's nothing about this system that has to be static. It's changed, its implementation has changed quite dramatically over time. The basic architecture has remained more or less the same, which has been nice. It's been a kind of a stable environment. But in all honesty, is this the vodka that we ordered earlier today?
Straight up.
I thought this would make a much more interesting interaction, you know. It'll be funnier and funnier for us. No
Yeah,
one else
hey,
will think it's funny, but we will. Right?
Hang on, well, hang on, I'm with you. I'll just,
I thought
Thank you.
this was going to be the part where you're drinking the glass and you're doing a ventriloquism act or something like that. Okay, so in terms of evolution,
yeah.
first of all, because it's a layered system, you can keep adding things on top of the previous layers. When Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, he had the advantage that the internet was already there. And so that was a layer that supported the basic design of the World Wide Web. And without that, he would have had, you know, something like Doug Engelbart had, which is a one computer World Wide Web, small world. So Tim had the advantage of this big infrastructure. The same thing is generally true. Every time you create a layer of standardization, you create a platform for other people to build things on top of. And at Google, we really pride ourselves on trying to do that. If you look at Google Earth and Google Maps and things like that, we offer this application programming interface to let other people take information that's geographically indexed and display it through the Google Earth platform. So I see at least one avenue for continued evolution of the internet based on new layers of standardization as time goes on. Another possibility, of course, is that people invent new protocols for new kinds of applications. So that means this is horizontally extendable as well as vertically extendable. So in the early days of internet, we had the TCP protocol, we had UDP protocols, and we had file transfer and email, and that was about it. Now we have HTTP for the World Wide Web, we have real-time communication protocols, and there are a variety of things that lie just above either IP or UDP or TCP that can continue to extend from horizontally speaking. So I think there's plenty of room here for continued evolution.
Yeah. To complement that then, when did you realize the internet, and I know you've said there was never an aha moment, there was never that eureka moment, but was there a point that you realized, did you realize yourself and as the team that were involved in that TCP IP development that it was going to make a difference? Maybe not such a difference, but it was going to make a difference.
Oh no, there's absolutely a moment, no question in my mind. I remember this vividly. Yeah. 1988. Now, from my point of view, internet starts in 1973 when Bob and I started writing the first papers describing it. So 15 years into this, 5 years after it went into operation, it was turned on in 1983. It's been in operation since that time. But in 1988, I walked into a conference in San Francisco. It was called Interop, started by a good friend of mine that stood for interoperability because that's what the internet was trying to do. We walked into this exhibition. We saw a two-story display from Cisco Systems, which was at that point a relatively new company. It had only been around for a couple of years. And when I was walking into the display or exhibition area with Eric Benamou, who was at that time the CEO of 3Com, a company that was started by Bob Metcalfe to make Ethernet hardware. So I walked in and I saw this big two-story display, and I turned to Eric and I said, "How much do these cost?" And he said, "Well, $250,000, not counting how much it costs to put people in them, you know, to service the customers who'd come to the exhibition. That might be another $250,000. And I remember just stopping dead in my tracks thinking, somebody thinks they're going to make money out of the internet. And so I realized at that point that if we didn't do something, that ordinary people, residential users, would never get access to the net because up until that point, it had been entirely funded by governments. In the United States, by the Defense Department, Department of Energy, Department of NASA, and Department of Defense, and NSF. And in other countries, similarly, these were research networks. So I thought, well, the only way that we're going to get the general public to get access to the internet is to turn it into a commercial economic engine. And so I began to proselytize for commercial operation. And some of my colleagues hated the idea. They said, what? You want to let the general public have access to our sandbox, to our toys? Are you crazy? I said, well, I want everybody to have access to this. So for me, that was an aha moment, and it triggered an initiative to get public access to the network by allowing commercial traffic to flow over the internet backbones. And so for me, that really was a big aha moment.
Yeah. One of the points you've made before and quite recently was as engineers, if you come out of this and be scientists, technologists, engineers, mathematicians, regardless of what you do, you're going to have to learn some salesmanship, personship. We've got to be politically correct, but it is salesmanship, because Dr. Cerf made the point last night that, you know, I'm an electronics engineer by trade. I used to love making things. I'm way behind it now, but I sell stuff. But the biggest part of what I sell is convincing other people that my ideas are good and sound and getting their buy-in. And you made the comment last night, I believe, that engineers have to do that. You can come up with the internet as an idea, and you can come up with making it publicly available. But unless you can get other people to buy into that concept or idea, which is a massive part of innovation and invention.
This is actually very true. I remember as a young engineer not understanding the difference between marketing and sales, for example. I thought it was all kind of the same thing, and I thought it was sort of silly. Well, over time, I learned a few things about that. First of all, I asked one of the vice presidents of marketing, what's the job of the marketing guy? And he said, well, the marketing guy is supposed to tell the sales guy where to go and what to say when he gets there. And that was, I thought, a pretty good encapsulation of what the difference between marketing and sales. The sales guy's got to close the sale. The marketing guy has to help him figure out what to say in order to do that. But I learned also that if you couldn't sell your ideas, you weren't going to do anything very big, because anything the scale of the internet requires literally millions of people to decide they want that too. And so if you want to do something really big, you're going to have to figure out how to get other people to want to do that. If you've read a story about Tom Sawyer, he's painting a fence, and he's got an apple core, and he convinces a bunch of his friends that they want to whitewash the fence in exchange for a bite of the apple. And yeah, I don't know how the heck he sold them on that, but they whitewashed the fence. So the idea here is that you need to exercise those skills. You have to find a way to excite other people about what it is that you want to do. Otherwise, you won't get enough horsepower to get anything done. You won't get people to make investments to build companies in order to build the equipment or services or other products that you need in order to do some big thing. Now, Bob and I were not trying to do a global system. What we were trying to do was to build a capability for the American Defense Department that was scalable. And so the big deal here was not building of a giant thing, but building of something that could scale if the need arose. And in the end, of course, the need was apparent because of the applications that the internet was capable of supporting. So we were lucky that the design actually fulfilled the expectation, but we were not setting out to change the world. In fact, I generally don't think it's a good idea to start out that way. The thing you should do is concentrate on actually making something work. And it's amazing how convincing things are when they work. You know, it's easier to sell stuff that works than it is to sell slideware that doesn't. So I think I never started out to change the world, but I did want to change the capability that was available to people to do things, tools.
And that excitement that you can get others, if you can get other people excited, it means that you're excited and you've got belief there. And we'll maybe chat a little bit later on about failure, you know, not being afraid to fail, but we'll go through that. Any questions, any other questions from the floor? Anybody want to stick their hand up and ask a question? Right in the middle at the back there, please. If you can tell us who you are and which school you're from, please. And
what person in history has inspired you to contribute to the needs of society?
I didn't hear it. So.
Sorry, again, I missed it too. What person in society?
What person in society has inspired you to contribute to the needs of society? Sorry, what person in history? Yeah.
What person in history has inspired you to contribute to the needs of society?
So who other... You know, I like standing up better than sitting down, if you
Okay.
don't
Have a
mind, because
drink.
I can actually see you.
Make yourself at home.
All right. So, you know, the first book that I read about science was by a man named Paul de Kruif, and the book was called Microbe Hunters. It was all about people who were learning about bacteria. And for me, that was, first, I don't know why this is the case, but for me, suddenly I realized that science was something that lets you understand the world in a way that no other discipline permitted. And I was completely convinced at that point that I would become a scientist of one kind or another. I didn't necessarily have pictures of scientists up on the walls of my room or anything like that, but I learned very quickly that the discipline that science imposes on you is really important. Namely, that you have a hypothesis and you test it, and if your test doesn't confirm the hypothesis, you have to be willing to accept the idea that you were wrong and change your models and change the hypothesis that you have. And this humility in the face of fact, for me, is probably the most important aspect of science. And I have great respect for all scientists who are willing to change their minds when the facts tell them otherwise, tell them that their ideas are wrong. Ideologues, on the other hand, not idiots necessarily, but ideologues are people who cling to theories that are not supported by fact. And I don't have much good to say about that. Okay.
And do you see yourself as a scientist or a technologist or an engineer, or are you a little bit of a hybrid?
Well, of course, my official degree is in computer science, so that makes me a computer scientist, except for one thing. I've been questioning where the science is in computer science, and there's several editorials on this subject. If you can't make predictions, it's hard to claim that something is science. So I think some of you should be very skeptical of whether there is a science in computer science. Some of my colleagues don't like it when I say that. In honest truth, I'm an engineer because I'm not satisfied to just understand something. I want to build things that work. And there's nothing more satisfying than actually working through something and getting it not only to work, but also do something useful that other people will use. Surely you would have the same reaction. If you design and build something that other people find useful, there's great satisfaction in that. And that's what engineering is about.
So there are no wrong or right answers, but I wonder if I could get a quick show of hands before we take the next question. How many people want to design things, and how many people want to build things in the room? So how many people, hands in the air, if you feel that you want to design stuff? Hands up.
Lots of people.
That's good.
Good.
And how many people actually want to make stuff?
Why are you making a distinction between those two?
Because I think the question about science and technology,
Yeah.
the doing and getting things done, and the theory side of that
Yeah.
thing, and there's sometimes there can be perceived to be a gap that the two don't intermix, that because I've designed something and then I want to go off and test it, I've had a great idea but I can't execute it. And there seems to be a mix in the room that people
Well,
have got great ideas. Possibly.
So I don't know, maybe we should wrestle
Yeah.
on this one. I have this sense that you can't really do good design if you don't understand how it's going to work. And the best way to find out how something works is to build it. Now, there's a movement in the US, and maybe there's a movement here. It's called the maker movement, and it's all about making things. It's being stimulated by the invention of something called the 3D printer, which, frankly, sounded like science fiction just a few years ago. The idea that you could send a digital design of something, some complex object, and feed it into a thing that looks like a printer, and have a physical object pop out as opposed to a flat sheet of paper is pretty amazing. They have become quite sophisticated. They use multiple kinds of materials now. Some of them involve metal as well as plastics and things of that sort. At least one of them is being used to print skeletal frameworks for organs, organ replacement, where you create this little framework and then you populate it with pluripotent cells, and they sort of build a bladder or build some other kind of body part. So we're not at the point where you can regrow an arm or anything like that, but the notion that you could print somebody's duodenum is pretty amazing. So this notion of 3D printing is stimulating a great deal of interest in making things and designing things. And think about the economics of this for a second. Normally, you build something and then you ship it to a target where it's delivered for use. Now the idea is you transmit the design of something and it actually gets made at the destination. Now, in order for that to work, the raw materials have to get to the 3D printer somehow. So now we have a very different kind of economic where we're delivering raw materials to places all over the world where they are combined through this 3D printing process. This is at the beginning stages. It's not clear exactly how all this is going to come out. In the long run, I imagine we're going to print these components, and maybe we will build robots that will assemble them. And so this whole process of manufacturing will be literally transformed in some way that is almost impossible to predict. But it's certainly, it has potential now, which is why the designing and the engineering of things, is why I'm struggling here, are so closely related. You have an opportunity, if you've designed something, to actually find out if it works, because you could print it on the 3D printer and see. So that's not the only way of manufacturing. But it just feels to me like the whole business of design and engineering is changing in the physical world. In the computing world, it's already been changed. With the advent of a computer, the design is programs, and the only way that you find out if they work is to run them. And so you can't be a scientist in the computer science sense of the word and do anything useful without actually writing a piece of code and figuring out whether it works or not. So maybe that's why I feel the two are so closely linked.
Yeah, absolutely, valid question. Anything else from the floor? Would anybody like to raise their hand or ask them through? We've got a couple of hands over at the side here. Take one at the back there, please.
Hi, I've been thinking about the transhumanism movement and how you feel that current technology is going to equate into that, like Google Glass or possibly even Bluetooth headsets, stuff like that.
I'm getting some of that.
Yeah, so transhumanism.
Transforming technologies
Humanism.
like Google Glass.
Yeah.
So, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because Google Glass is really a very interesting phenomenon. I neglected to bring mine with me. I'm embarrassed to tell you that. I left it in my apartment in London. What the Google Glass does is put a computer into the same sensory environment that you are in. So Google Glass's computer is hearing what you hear and seeing what you see, and potentially participating in that environment. So let me give you an example of how this might unfold. Let's imagine that we have a blind German speaker and we have a deaf American Sign Language speaker, and they're both wearing Google Glass. So let's see what happens. The German blind speaker begins to speak. The deaf guy's Google Glass hears the German, does speech recognition, translates the German into English, and then presents the English to the deaf American Sign Language speaker. So he sees the captions in his Google Glass. The sign language speaker begins to sign in response. The blind guy can't see this, but the Google Glass can. And so it sees the signs, interprets these as English, and then translates the English into German, and then speaks the German in the bone conduction audio part of the Google Glass so the blind guy can hear it. Now, we can actually do all of that except for recognizing ASL, and even that might be possible over time. I'm thinking, for example, of a video system that's sampling at much higher rate than normal, so the computer could actually watch the signs happen more slowly and try to figure out what's going on. And I've actually seen one other example, which is not a video interpretation of ASL, but a glove that you can wear, which has enough sensors on it that you can correctly identify the positioning of the fingers of the hand. And that may be enough in order for the computer to actually recognize ASL. It's not quite as good as doing it with video. But the idea here is that these devices can become part of our environment and therefore have a lot of context when we're asking them questions. So if I point to a bottle of wine, for example, and say, what are the tasting notes for this bottle of wine, apropos of dinner last night, the Google Glass can see the label. It can hear me say, what are the tasting notes, and go and find the answer to that question because it has enough context to do that. Or if I say, where's the nearest Thai restaurant, if the system knows where I am because of GPS, then that's a well-formed question. And it can figure out, if it knows what the maps are and what restaurants are around, like Google Maps and Google Earth do, then it's possible to respond to that question because we have enough context. So the thing that gets me very excited about some of these technologies is bringing computing power into a context that we're comfortable with and not having to use mice and keyboards anymore to interact with their power, but rather have normal interactions with them. So I'm really looking forward to the possibility of a more or less human conversation with computers to help them understand what I'm trying to do and get them to help me do it.
And you feel that's there now? Do you feel the middleware between?
I think we are getting closer and closer to it, although I have to tell you, this reminds me of artificial intelligence 50 years ago. In the 1960s, we used to think that we could get translation to happen by just pouring a dictionary into the computer and then give it the words. So we tried this out at Stanford. We got a Russian-English dictionary, and we put that into the computer, and we took a common English expression, out of sight, out of mind. And we ran it into the translator and turned it into Russian, then we translated the Russian back into English, and it came out, invisible idiot. And we realized at that point we needed work to do now on this artificial intelligence for language translation. That's taken quite a long time. At this point, we have actually pretty good language translation capabilities. Google Translate is quite good. So we're at the edge now of some pretty powerful stuff. Just to give you one other example, the self-driving cars at Google, it started out as a challenge from the American Defense Department, build a vehicle that could drive itself. The first year, 7 of them ended up in the ditch, not very far away from the starting line. The next year, 7 of the competitors actually made it on a 127-mile drive. Stanford University won that year. The next year was a competition for driving in an urban environment. And the winner at that point was Carnegie Mellon. So Google hired both teams from Stanford and Carnegie Mellon. They're working at Google X today. And the big challenge for them now is that after having gotten a fleet of cars to drive 500,000 miles in San Francisco on the city streets without any accidents, they're now trying to get them to drive door to door. This is harder than just being on the city street. It's one thing to figure out how to stay in lane, to recognize if there's a signal that tells you to stop or go. But if you're trying to navigate in an underground garage or figure out how to navigate to somebody's front door and then bring them to the office, that's harder. And so we set ourselves the challenge of getting the thing to actually go from door to door. So all of this is happening. Here we are, just in the beginning of the 21st century. By the time 10 years have gone by, I expect that we will have potentially commercial capability to allow these cars to drive. There are even laws that have been passed in the United States that allow these cars to be on the road legally.
Fantastic. So I wish I was 8 as well now, because all this is now in front. So since we're talking about Google, which is relevant, and I know we have another question in the corner here. Are the balloons, the ones that Google are testing just now, a temporary solution, or do you feel that internet will become increasingly permanently delivered with remote mobile devices like the Google Balloon, which has been used, I think, extensively in Africa just now in places?
So this is a kind of an interesting situation. What has happened over the last decade or two is that the internet has become increasingly accessible over radio-based systems, so wireless has really been important. But eventually, wireless has to go to ground. And so an optical fiber capability has turned out to be very important, certainly for our systems at Google. We connect all of our data centers together with very, very high-speed optical fiber networks. Some of them are running 100 gigabits a second, some are running 400 gigabits a second, and some will be running at a terabit per second sometime in the next 5 or 6 years. So the wireless side, though, has turned out to be important because of the tetherless capability, the ability to move around. My guess is that both of these capabilities are going to be necessary. Here's a place where you could really help. Historically, the way we have allocated and used radio has been to slice it into little narrow bands and assign them to different parties for specific use. So whether it's mobile telephony and GSM, or emergency services, or other kinds of applications. But radio doesn't have to be used that way. The reason we do it that way now is that way back in 1912 or 1916, we had crappy receivers. And they were so bad that all you could do was to clear the channel and say only the transmitter for that frequency could be used for that one purpose, and no one else could be allowed in that frequency band. But now we have digital signal processing. We have a variety of code division multiple access capabilities where the signal is very complex, and the receivers are getting smarter and smarter about extracting a signal from what is otherwise a rather cluttered environment. The reason I bring this up is that we could make far better use of the available radio spectrum if we could share within band. And so that's the next big step, in my view, in the use of radio to support things like internet, is to allow concurrent use of the same frequency bands using these various coding tricks and analysis in order to extract the signal that you're interested in. So this is an area that's still open for a great deal of innovation.
Okay, thank you. Did I see another hand over here? Are you still rather? Yep, please.
What's your opinion on like the site, the Pirate Bay, and the way that the government tries to deal with it and other kinds of data sharing?
So sites like Pirate Bay, what's your opinion on sites like Pirate Bay and how governments try and-
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, I'm not going to make any political statements, but let me make a couple of observations. Pirate Bay is all about copyright. Now, copyright was originally, if you go back into UK history, you discover what copyright was about. It had to do with the printing press, and it had to do with preventing people from printing things that were harmful to the crown. And so the original notion of copyright was you got the right to print something because the crown said it was okay. When copyright was instantiated in the United States in the 1700s, our Constitution said the purpose behind copyright was to allow the creator of a work to benefit from it for a finite period of time, after which the work would become public domain for the benefit of the general public. The copyright attorneys of the world have done everything they can to take that finite period of benefit time and extend it as far as they can. And now we have what's called the Mickey Mouse Law, and that is the one that says you benefit, the author or creator benefits for 70 years after his or her death. I mean, this is extending things well beyond the original American 14-year limit. You can tell I'm not really happy about that. So now we have that problem, the overextension of copyrights, which is what drives Pirate Bay in part to say we want access to things on a more reasonable schedule. The second thing, though, and the one that's even more important, is that the notion of public domain has been given short shrift. It's very important that we share things in the public domain because that's how the general population gets smarter, because it has open and free access to content. There's a big push in the US and perhaps also here for what's called open access for research results. If the research is supported by a government, theory has been paid for and therefore it should be openly accessible. It turns out that that doesn't necessarily mean free. And the reason for that is very simple. Even when you intend for the content to be freely available, it may still cost you something to put it in digital form and maintain its accessibility on physical equipment. It's not like the equipment does cost money to build and operate. So in the end, there has to be some business model that allows for the digital information to be made accessible in perpetuity. So free, open does not necessarily mean free, but one wants it not to be otherwise encumbered. The problem we have right now is that content in digital form is so easily reproduced and distributed. And in fact, to go back to my observation about how browsers work, a browser is a giant copying engine. That's what the World Wide Web is. The browser reaches out, copies a file, and interprets it. Now you can imagine, if your business model is to prevent people from copying things, the World Wide Web feels like it's a really dangerous design and dangerous piece of technology, and yet we all recognize how useful it's turned out to be. That translates into another problem, which is how to rebuild the business models that support copyrights in such a way that they work in this digital environment. One answer to that question is not to prevent people from copying, but to create business models that make it attractive not to pirate the material. And so I'm going to use an overused example, and that's iTunes coming from Apple. They said, why do you have to pay for a whole album when all you wanted was one track? And so if they sold the track for 99 cents, would that encourage people to simply pay? Because that was easier than going off and trying to find a ripped off copy of the song that you wanted. And in fact, that's turned out to be a very successful business model. So for my money, I think that the technologists, the creators of works, songs and movies and other software and so on, and the creators, the lawyers, and the technologists should be sitting down together and asking what business models might make things more attractive for the consumer to pay rather than steal. And I think we've not explored that space adequately. That's where I would go. And I hope that the end result of that is that the Pirate Bay notions won't be needed anymore because we have transformed the availability of content in a way that supports it and makes the public comfortable.
Excellent. We have time for one last question, if we can finish on that, and it's one from the slides. What was it like working with NASA, and in what capacity were you involved, and what was the most exciting part? Now, you've touched on that earlier.
Well, we did talk a little bit. I'll tell you what was really the most exciting thing for me. One of my colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory wrote the software that we put into the epoxy spacecraft in order to test the theory that this bundle-based protocol would work from, in this case, 81 light seconds away. And I remember sitting down with him as this test was being done, wondering and asking him finally, what does it feel like to know that you have a piece of software that's in this spacecraft that's, you know, hundreds of millions of miles away, and you're talking to it. You're actually making something happen from that far away. And he said it was pretty exciting. And I realized that that was the thing that made me so excited about networking in general. The idea that you could do something here that had an impact on something that was much farther away, even if it was only 3,000 or 6,000 or 15,000 miles, and in his case, of course, 115 million miles. The idea that you could do something locally that had such a big impact so far away, talk about thinking big, is the thing that really grabbed me. And I had to, he has to feel really cool about this, that he could do something that was so much bigger than the entire Earth, touch something so far away, and that still excites me today.
Excellent. So we've tried to stimulate you to think how big you are thinking. I'm sure you'll agree today that Dr. Cerf has given us a universal view on how big you can really think, and an aperture the size of the solar system is not something you're going to find down Jessop's, let's face it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to put your hands together and thank Dr. Cerf for a fantastic morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you again. So, you can drink your vodka and make yourself comfortable, and the ladies will. But if you, I don't know what our schedule is, Polly, on the way out. school, there's some bags to collect at the back of the hall. So some of the schools, sorry, yes, thank you. So thanks for looking at me. That makes me recall so many things. But that whole process of you coming in today, some of you didn't register and pick up your goodie bags. As you leave the hall here, at the far end of the room, there are goodie bags in there. One of them contains 500, no, it doesn't really. But one of them, none of them contain anything like that at all. But if you haven't got a goodie bag, please go and enjoy it. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to the more grown-ups in the room who have chaperoned you and looked after you and got you here. Safe trip back to the schools, and big thinking, please. Thank you very much. That was fantastic.